Thank you for joining us either in person or virtually for today's session, Accessibility and Scholarly Communications, Ensuring Access for All. My name is Lisa Janicki Hinchliffe. I am a professor and coordinator for information literacy services and instruction at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And I want to acknowledge as well Rachel Scher from Springer Nature, who was instrumental in bringing this panel together with me. Joined by 3 additional speakers who are all remote and in fact about as distributed. Well, we don't have anyone from Asia, but we could be about as distributed as we are. So we're very grateful for technology and the support that we have from the Charleston Conference in order to bring this group together. I want to share with you a little bit about how we came to having this session today on accessibility. For the last year, I have been undergoing a research project that was funded through a Catalyst grant at Lyrasis, because I was concerned as libraries increasingly point patrons into the preprint server and institutional repository and other alternative sources of information from the scholarly publishing cycle, sometimes as alternatives to subscribing to the version of record, that they were pointing people at resources that those studies show the content is relatively the same. Perhaps we have questions related to whether the content is accessible. So this is a slightly confusing thing because we're talking about open access resources. So presumably we would think that they are indeed accessible because they're open access. And this is the question I wanted to ask. Are these resources indeed actually accessible? And so over the past year, we conducted a study sampling 5 different preprint servers in order to determine whether we could have sort of a sense of the state of the situation. So we sampled from OSF preprints at the Center for Open Science. So, by the way, shared these results with all of these preprint server managers. So I am not sharing anything that they aren't already aware of today. We searched across these preprint servers for keywords. In particular, we used COVID-19, since at this point in time, we knew that every preprint server would have content related to COVID-19. And so we wouldn't have a keyword effect affecting our looking at this. We looked at the home page, the search page, the result of the search page, and 3 preprint articles and associated downloaded files. We used the WCAG criteria, and we were particularly looking at those criteria related to people who had limited perception of color, vision, hearing, image manipulation, and the like. With website accessibility, we looked at keyboard navigation, document structure and forms, how the data was presented visually, the appearance of alternative text, how audio and video was integrated, and any dynamic content and widgets. So needless to say, when you do accessibility testing or investigation, you're definitely in the qualitative mode. We're not looking at how many times we saw a particular error or the like, but instead an overall assessment of the state of things. I'm just going to pause for a second. Rachel? Okay. Great. So this has been the motivator for this panel today, this kind of question of what kind of accessibility questions can we answer. So I'm just not going to keep you in suspense, and I'll go ahead and share my findings. And then now that we have the technology worked out, also invite my co-panelists to begin participating as well. We found that preprint servers varied widely in their accessibility. We found implementations at the highest level of web accessibility, and we also found room for improvement. And on almost every platform, we found certain features and functions that were wholly inaccessible to somebody who was using a screen reader. We found that the areas that tested well were the web content, sort of the interface, the typical things that one finds on any website. But we found issues related to the search tools, particularly related to unlabeled filtering and faceting buttons. We found issues related to what are called modal dialogues, where you have contact forms or feedback forms. Those would almost always have accessibility problems. We found, ironically, the error messages themselves were often inaccessible. So if a user was having difficulty with the platform, the error messages that would have told them what the difficulty was were inaccessible. We found content that's only available by hovering over something, which means it's not accessible. Low color contrast was particularly disappointing, as it is a relatively easy thing to fix. But the largest by far area of concern were the PDFs. Many PDFs were wholly inaccessible. And remember, the PDF is what the user reader is presumably going for. Some of them were readable, excluding the images, but not a single one that we downloaded was fully accessible. And in particular, we found a number of PDFs where the text itself was actually an image file, which means that the entire document was inaccessible. So these are the kinds of questions that came to my mind then, is that if we are going to be referring users to these sources as alternatives to the version of record or even supplemental, how do we do this in a way that doesn't create a kind of equity problem among people with disabilities? There are additional issues, like having alt text is not the same as having good alt text. And how much is good enough in the technology, and when do we have to go to other supplemental methods? But one of the things we would note is that if a user was having difficulty, often the form for getting help was inaccessible, and so getting help wasn't actually an option. And so historically, ADA puts this on the individual to have to advocate for themselves. But I think for digital content, we can think of ourselves as also advocates for our users in this area. So I was really pleased that these three co-panelists, who are now all connected technologically, were able to join me today and to share about the work that they are doing in their respective organizations that look at different aspects of the scholarly publication and scholarly communications ecosystem. And so as each of them speaks today, I will ask each of them to introduce themselves, and for the first question, to share kind of a lengthy, longish overview of the work that they are doing in this area.
Okay, thank you so much. My goodness, I'm glad that we at least weren't one of the earlier sessions and are further along in troubleshooting tech issues. Okay, hello everyone. I'm Ange Zaytsev. I am the User Services Librarian at HathiTrust, and my pronouns are she or they. I'm really delighted to be here to talk about this important subject. And before I get into it, I want to start by focusing on the individuals whom we all support with our various services. So disabled students face a whole host of challenges in college. They navigate a world that really wasn't built for them. There are physical barriers to building access, especially on historical campuses, but also I'm astonished at the number of modern buildings that are not built from a universal accessibility perspective. Information about accommodations is hard to find or scattered across multiple departmental websites. Teaching faculty simply lack understanding of how to support disabled students. And the challenge that at HathiTrust we're most particularly focused on is that often course materials and research content is provided in inaccessible formats. So at HathiTrust, our mission has always been to preserve and provide access to the shared digital collection that our member libraries have entrusted us to manage. And we've crafted services specifically aimed at print disabled and blind patrons, and do our best to position the needs of these individuals at the center of our work. So today I'll be focusing on one service specifically, the accessible text request service. But before I get into that, I want to talk a little bit about what the HathiTrust collection is for those who are less familiar. So the HathiTrust collection is primarily composed of digitized print books coming from our member library collections. And I emphasize the digitized print books because the way in which they're created and get to us affects how you can use them and the accessibility of the content. What is in the HathiTrust collection is basically whatever is on the shelves of our member libraries and was selected for digitization. So our collection comes from all over the US and the world. It's been contributed by over 60 libraries, with University of California and University of Michigan being our top contributors. And we've also have international collections from the Universidad Complutense de Madrid and Keio University in Japan. There's over 400. Did that echo problem go away? Yes. So in terms of how we provide access, our access is based on the copyright status of the books. Whatever is in the public domain is available to anyone to read, not just our member affiliated users. Anybody on the internet can access our public domain content. Whatever is copyrighted in the HathiTrust collection is restricted. So there is about 6.8 million books and volumes in the HathiTrust collection that are open access, and the remaining 10.7 million volumes are available through the accessible text request service only. So this service is a mediated access service through which staff members on our campuses can retrieve copyrighted texts in order to provide them to their eligible patrons with print disabilities. I don't know what keeps causing that. Yes, it's a very painful echo. So to clarify, print disabled users are able to find and access through our accessible platform the 6.8 million texts that are in the public domain, but not the remaining 10.7 million books. To access one of those 10.7 million books, the student needs to submit a request to their disability services office or to their library. And then upon receiving that request, the staff member looks through a variety of resources to try to find the text in one of them. The staff member tends to look through different databases, different collections, including Access Text Network, the Internet Archive, Bookshare, their university library collection, or they may provision it from the publisher or the faculty member who assigned the text in their class. And that's one of the challenges that we know that these disability services staff deal with. There's simply so many possible resources out there, and just trying to find a copy of the text is a challenge. However, when they find that text in HathiTrust, those staff members have special access privileges that allow them to download even copyrighted text. And then the staff member may do additional cleanup or remediation work to make sure that the file meets the needs of the students. Since we started offering this service in 2013, over 7,700 texts have been retrieved through this service by the 121 campuses that have signed up for it. And that's pretty low volume compared to our public domain access stats, but this is definitely one of the most critical services we offer. Disability services staff face a number of their own difficulties trying to provide accommodations. They're often under-resourced, understaffed, and flooded with demands. And we want to do whatever we can to ease the work of these dedicated staff and to help ensure that print disabled users are able to complete their degrees. So that's kind of like what I had prepared, and I'm really excited to hear from my colleagues about their own experiences and services.
Who thought that this is what the future would be like with all the video conferencing? Okay, so I am Rob Smith. I'm from EBSCO. I am the accessibility product manager for EBSCO across all of our product lines. I previously worked in product management at EBSCO for our ebooks team. I've also worked at Credo Reference, which is a smaller library company. And I was on the accessibility team at JPMorgan Chase for a couple of years. So I just want to talk a little bit about our accessibility efforts here at EBSCO with a focus more on full text content. So EBSCO is an aggregator. And as Lisa said, the web user interface of our search product is the thing that's most under our control, and it's where most of our auditing and development efforts have focused over the years. We have an internal accessibility process. So all of our designers, product managers, and developers work with accessibility as early as possible in the process. And then we work with third-party experts and users to vet our efforts. And we've had a lot of success with that over the years, building that into our process. But that's just the web interface. And when you make it to full text content, then the story is a little trickier. So we're taking in content from thousands of sources, and we have millions of documents. So that can be a real challenge when it comes to accessibility. So EBSCO works from our position as an aggregator to positively influence accessibility among our broad range of publishers. So as mentioned previously, PDF in particular is a format with a lot of challenges. Most PDFs have accessibility problems, and as an author or a remediator, it's hard to make PDFs accessible. Adobe, unfortunately, hasn't done a lot over the years to make that process easy. When it comes to things like reading order or tagging of PDFs in particular, it can be a real challenge to do. So one of our big strategies around this has been to encourage adoption of HTML-based formats, which are generally superior for accessibility and easier to produce in an accessible way. Now, that doesn't mean that we are thinking of replacing PDF entirely, but in an ideal world, I think we'd like to be able to deliver both. So in the realm of journal articles, we focused a lot on getting some sort of structured data from a publisher, whether it's HTML, XML, or any other type of structured data that can then be turned into HTML for display to the end user. So that's going to have the possibility of a lot of rich accessibility features like headings, tagged tables, easier ways to convey text alternatives for images, things like that. And on the ebook side, we've been pushing the adoption of the EPUB format, which is an HTML-based format as well, quite a bit. So we think both of those options are superior for accessibility on a number of fronts, not just when it comes to things like semantics and screen readers, but also reflow, use on small devices, and features like that, which can be a challenge with PDF. PDF, of course, is really a nice portable format, though, and many users may prefer it. So I don't see it going away anytime soon. One of the biggest differentiators between PDF and these other formats is page numbers, actually. And so, using page numbers in your citations is a very important and desirable thing for academic content. And so we've been working with some standards bodies, particularly on the EPUB specification, to try and get page numbers built into that in a way that is at least somewhat predictable across different vendors and reading systems. And I'm actually encouraged to see that the latest revision of WCAG 2, or Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG 2.2, includes some same things in this realm of page numbers. So that's a really big thing for academic content. And I think that will help us get to a world where we're less reliant on PDF as a format. One thing that Lisa mentioned with the preprint content is image-only PDFs. So that in particular is really just a bane for accessibility. It's really bad. It means that the document is completely inaccessible to certain users. And so that in particular, discouraging image-only PDFs has been a big thing that we've been trying to push. One of the more interesting projects we've done in this realm is some work around automated accessibility validation. So we conducted a pilot project with our EPUB ebook content. So that's about 1.5 million ebooks. And we used a tool called DAISY ACE. So the DAISY Consortium is an accessibility nonprofit that works a lot with book content. And they produce a tool based on the AXE engine, which is an accessibility automation rules engine to validate EPUB content. So Automated testing of accessibility is something that is, it only covers a small subset of the possible things that you can test relating to accessibility. As Lisa mentioned, a lot of it is qualitative and what the experience actually is. But there are a subset of criteria in the web content accessibility guidelines that can be automated. And that at least gives a directional idea of the sort of accessibility health of content or of a website. So we ran this tool on our entire corpus of EPUB ebooks, and it's been in place for about a year and a half. And so that's across 171 publishers. And thus far, we have seen a 10% improvement in measurable accessibility across these publishers after introducing this report and then sharing this data back to them. And some of the publishers have had no increase at all, that maybe they're not looking at the report that we're providing them, or they haven't made any changes to their process yet. Some individual publishers, though, had between 50 and 80% improvements. So the significant improvement to the accessibility of their content. And that's not something that we can entirely take credit for, but there's at least a correlation with when we've introduced this report. It may be indicative of more attention to accessibility throughout the industry as well. So that's good news either way. So we're working to do more to socialize this and give this information to publishers so that they can take action, as well as just having conversations with publishers to understand their accessibility process and how we can most optimally work with them as an aggregator. And our plans are to expand this analysis to other content types, including PDF ebooks and PDF journals and HTML journals. So the last thing that I want to mention is, I mentioned DAISY already. We're also working with an organization, Benetech, who you may be familiar with. They're primarily known for Bookshare. Benetech is working on a process, and this is also primarily focused on books at the moment, although journals are a big area of interest for me. Benetech has a new process where they're actually working with publishers to sort of vet their process. It's very hard to vet the accessibility of every book or every article, especially when you're not using an automated tool. So Benetech has been working on a process which they call Global Certified Accessible. And this is focused on books, but it's possible that it will expand out to other content types. So when a publisher goes through this, they're able to have their process audited and iterate and make sure that they're producing the most accessible content possible. And then there's sort of like a seal of approval to say, if you acquire content through this source, then it's going to be more accessible. So that's something that we're working with them to support, and hopefully we'll be seeing more of this throughout the industry and seeing more improvements with content accessibility. All right, so that's everything from my end for the moment. So I guess I'll just go ahead and pass it right off to Jude.
Thank you very much, Rob, for that. That nice segue. I've been invited. My name's Jude Robinson, and I'm head of front-end development for Springer Nature. And as part of that, I'm partially responsible for accessibility. And in fact, that's where I spend the vast majority of my time and effort these days is explicitly about accessibility. And Lisa invited me to speak about our efforts to address accessibility for authors and editors across our platforms. And I'm going to cheat a little bit and speak a bit more broadly, but I can, however, start by saying that we're prioritizing authors and editors, and we know we need to make it super convenient for people to use our systems. And we aim to support the transition to open access and open research by creating very user-centric products and services. And the strap line that the teams involved in that are sort of developing to is, you focus on a research and we take care of the rest. And yeah, that's a lofty goal, but a good one. And the thing about that goal is that it isn't limited only to the roughly 80% of people who don't currently have a disability. It applies to all authors and editors. In fact, the more the merrier. So the aim for us is to make the author and editor experience as usable and as accessible as our journals, which are for the most part highly accessible. So there's a lot of tactical work taking place within teams to achieve that. And additionally, there's work taking place to make more wide-ranging systematic changes to the company. And there's a lot of experience and expertise within Springer Nature. We've been focusing on accessibility to some degree or another in various parts of the company since 2004. And some of the things that we've learned over that time are that accessibility is an outcome, and it's what you get when you change your culture and start doing inclusive design. And on that note, it was fascinating to hear Paul Sappho's keynote earlier. So much of that resonates so strongly. And inclusive product design means designing products that span economic, social, and cultural barriers. And it means designing not just for one type of user, usually affluent and non-disabled in technology, unfortunately, but many. Disability is a large part of inclusive product design because it's subject to all of those barriers. If you're disabled, you're far more likely to face economic, social, and cultural barriers and/or oppression and injustice. So in getting teams to focus on this, there are a few really key things to get them doing inclusive product design. The first one that's really important is that everyone on a team has to become aware of the role that they play. And this is so important. It's traditionally thought that, that accessibility is the role of, say, the front-end developer or someone in UX, the designer or a researcher or someone. And in fact, everyone has a role to play. Back-end developers have a role to play. QA has a role to play. The CEO of a company has a role to play. And accessibility has to be considered at every step of development as well. It's not something that you can leave until the end of the development of a product and then add accessibility. That makes as much sense as baking a blueberry muffin without blueberries and then trying to mush the blueberries in at the end and calling it a blueberry muffin. You know, that's not a blueberry muffin, that's a mess. So it has to be something which is thought about at every step, just like other non-functional requirements of development. So we're aiming for steady, gradual, ongoing improvement in practices and knowledge. No, not a project to fix stuff. And that notion is very much an anti-pattern. So we want to be focused on the gradual improvement over time. It doesn't matter what position a team is starting from, as long as they're continually improving. So we want to take teams through a process to embed this knowledge. And we have to take them through a few steps. It's awareness and acceptance. We need to then guide them to action. And we need them to additionally, we need to persuade them to promote the work that they've done afterwards, because it's also very important to get teams talking to each other, to get people talking to each other, and to create collaboration across the business. We're quite a large company. We've got hundreds of people involved in web development, and skill levels vary across the organization. And our aim is to achieve all of these things across all teams involved in development. And that takes an awful lot of work. So we've recognized it's an area that requires full-time dedicated support. So last year we started hiring dedicated accessibility specialists and helped train them to become professionally certificated as well. And those accessibility specialists are now becoming engaged in more and more long-running accessibility engagements with teams, allowing those teams to develop the necessary skills. So we're doing a very wide range of things to achieve accessibility and to bake it into the organization. And we're trying to do it in a way that benefits as many people as possible. So where we see an opportunity to benefit others as well, we take it. And as an example, we're soon going to be doing some work to help people, including librarians, with regards to evaluating voluntary product accessibility templates. And hopefully we'll be enabling people to more easily evaluate the accessibility maturity of vendors, which I know can be a very difficult thing to determine sometimes. And as another example, in the past, we created open source collaborative software that's now used by hundreds of organizations around the world to help evaluate the accessibility of their websites. In the UK, we've recently become a disability confident organization, and we're doing more and more work around DEI internally. And that's knowing that apart from the moral and legal arguments for doing so, it's simply sound business practice. You know, we would be doing ourselves damage if we weren't constantly aiming for a more inclusive environment. So there's many things that we've done, that we're doing, that we're trialing or have plans for, but I know I'm coming close to the time limit now, so I'll stop talking and save some time for questions in a bit. And thank you very much.
I'm going to wait for the sound to come back so you all can hear the questions that I'm going to ask you. Yes. Okay, great. So I have a question prepared in advance for each of our speakers. An aggregator rather than the creator, you know, of the content, and then your accessible text service that you've created.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm just going to repeat this because you cut out for a second for our online attendees. The question is, can you tell us about the challenges you face as a content aggregator rather than creator, and how that affects the accessible text service? So Rob touched on this a fair bit, actually, and at HathiTrust we experience similar problems. We can control the accessibility of our platform, but not our content. Most of the material in HathiTrust was produced via mass digitization projects, primarily Google and Internet Archive, and the aim was to scan as many books as fast as possible. And those books were scanned primarily as image files with corresponding plain text OCR, and that's what we received from those content creators. Our master files are image files and plain text files. And we then compile those files and generate PDF, EPUB, image, or plain text download files from our master files. And one common complaint we've received from our accessible text request service providers and other users is that the quality of the download files is poor and that the files are not accessible. But we do have a content quality team that manages the quality complaints we receive, and they work closely with the content creators to try to resolve quality problems. But we ourselves are not in a position to modify the files to fix the quality problems. We just accept whatever the content creators send us, and we're in the role of being the custodians of the collection. So as a result, this can put extra work on the disability services staff, who have to then clean up the files and make them more accessible. Through the HathiTrust Accessible Text Request Service, we've minimized the need for a disability services staff to scan the print books themselves, but we haven't yet solved the workflow problem of remediating those files. We are, however, exploring a solution to this problem, and actually John Unsworth was just talking about this in the previous session on accessibility. So we are currently at HathiTrust, we're participating in a Mellon funded grant project that's led by the University of Virginia, and we're also participating with Internet Archive and Bookshare. This is the FRAME grant, Federating Repositories of Accessible Materials for Higher Education. What a long acronym. But through the FRAME grant, we're trying to create both a central search interface that allows disability services staff to search across multiple collections at once, as well as a place where they can upload their corrected and remediated files to share those files with other campuses. So my hope is that it just becomes a natural part of workflows in disability services to upload those remediated files to this shared infrastructure. And over time, we hope to build a collection of these remediated files and to share them back to other campuses that need those texts as well. So that's my hope for how we're going to address this problem of inaccessible content.
Thank you, Angelina. Those of you who are also trying to listen in Pathable and the like, we have managed to enable the live text transcript. Perhaps ironic for the topic of our panel today, but we do have it. Also, I have put into Pathable the text of the questions that I'm asking to our speakers in case it is not accessible via the audio. So Jude, let's turn it to you. It's really great to hear that there is attention to the author and editor workflow. So I'm wondering what kind of feedback you're getting about this upcoming area of focus and the work that you're doing specifically around the author and editor workflows.
Thanks, Lisa. So the feedback that we're getting, again, I'm going to cheat slightly because I don't hear much of the actual feedback itself, and that's because I'm not involved with a team level work where they're actually getting that feedback. But what I can speak a little bit about is the kind of feedback that we're getting and how we're aiming to change that to include disabled people. So something we did earlier this year is sign up as a founding member of the Valuable 500, which is a global movement putting disability on the business leadership agenda. And what they do is they ask business leaders, CEOs mainly, to publicly commit to at least one disability or accessibility related improvement per year. And our CEO, Frank Brenken-Peters, who I believe is speaking later on today, committed to a number of things, including moving towards 20% of our user testing and user research happening with disabled users. So we're aiming to increase that to a level which is representative of the percentage of people with disability in society. There are many challenges involved in doing that, but that's absolutely what we're aiming for. And as well as that, we are also aiming to get more understanding of that kind of testing that needs to happen, and we're aiming to spread the specialist skills that are required to do that kind of user research around the company. And there's a lot of work that's gone into that over the past year. So I think that covers that.
Great, thank you, Jude. Rob, I'm going to ask you the final, you're in this interesting position where you're receiving content from the publishers and then working with them. So, in some ways your job would be easier the better the files that just come to you, right? So what would you recommend for next steps to what publishers could maybe more proactively do with respect to their content, particularly as I'm very heartened to see publishers in the Pathable chat saying like, okay, how can we make this better? So I see a real community commitment here. So what are those resources or next steps that you would recommend?
Well, one of the things that I've observed a lot around accessibility over the years is sometimes people think, this is such a big thing that we can't even think about it right now. And I would say just start with the very basics. So if we're talking about PDF content, for instance, it may be a lot of work and investment to get content or content production workflows up to full WCAG compliance. So, the first thing that should be done with any publisher, it's really just the very basic thing, is ensuring a PDF has a text layer, ensuring that it has the title reflected in a way that can be accessed by assistive technology, and that it has a language available so that a screen reader will know, which way to pronounce the content. That's like the very first possible thing. And beyond that, I'd really start to look into, okay, so what does our organization know about accessibility? How can we understand our process? Where are we missing the mark? And I think, there are so many third-party experts out there that bringing in someone to just take a look at the process and the tools that are being used, things like that is a great step. So eventually, as Jude said, I think that folks will find that there is a good business case for this. And in some cases, there are even like looming regulations and things like that around content that are on the horizon or already in place that will really start to make that business case a lot clearer.
And Jude, I'm kind of wondering if this might be something that you're able to address, which is the question of with respect to particularly mathematical textbooks, but one can imagine this comes up in journals where math is part of what is being published in scientific publications. What efforts have you sort of seen or could you recommend? I mean, anyone, but particularly I'm thinking this might be for you, around this whole idea of making mathematical notation, et cetera, accessible.
Thanks. So this is quite quite ironic because I did a lot of work decades ago, or a good decade or so ago, to do with MathML, but I have no idea with regards to the answer to this question. I don't know what's currently going on with that. I know that we were always looking to get remove the mathematical formulas and equations as images. That's something that we did as soon as we could. I don't know since then what we've been doing, so I'd have to look into that a bit more.
I can jump in a little bit. Yeah. So, there's a lot of structural markup like MathML, ChemML out there that it can help with this. And that is, one of those big process things that, from the author, someone that's later in the process editing or producing the document, they're not going to know the right way to reflect an equation, like a complex equation in MathML. So that's something that really needs to start at the beginning of the process, or you're going to be talking a really in-depth remediation. And if you think about, Angelina mentioned cases where you're taking books and scanning them in. You can't scan math equations. OCR is never going to pick that up. So there's going to need to be some human intervention. I actually have an intern that I work with who's blind, and he is a math major. And this has been one of the big challenges that he's had with his studies, is just getting math access. It's been a challenge for his instructors. It's been a challenge for the disability services office folks. And so it just takes a lot of time and commitment. One other thing that I'll mention, having worked with some customers on this, is if you are working with users who have these barriers, just understanding how to access this type of content at all is a good first step. So I know I was working not too long ago with a customer who they had content that was in MathML. It was like a path-based learning fully online, so not a PDF or anything like that. But they didn't know how, and they would sort of vet their content with the screen reader, which is great. That's great. But they didn't know how to turn the setting on to read math content. So, just familiarizing yourself with the assistive technology and the options that are available is a big step there as well, I think.
Great. Well, what I'm taking away from today's session is twofold. One, that I am very grateful that across the library publisher platform community, we are united in our commitment to addressing these issues. I think our experience even here today tells us that it can be difficult, but with effort and at least shared purpose, we can get things implemented quickly. But also we want to think about, what do we do so that these environments just are automatically as accessible as they can be. And then when they are not, where is the path to human assistance and the path that helps us move this forward? And so my apologies to anyone who was unable to participate fully because the transcription wasn't turned on. If you would like to email me, I will be sure to get a retranscripted version of the video made and sent to you after the fact, but I'll do my best. And also, it's just been wonderful to have this kind of attention to this topic. I will be around for the rest of the conference. I know that my co-panelists will be on email because they aren't at a conference. And please also, if you're here live in particular and are not in Pathable, there has been some discussion there as well that's been very interesting. Thank you for indulging our running a little bit over time right now. And thank you so much for joining us here today. Thank you. Thank you.